The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you. My name is Eric Radke from Sporties. I'm your facilitator for this evening, and we're delighted that you could join us as part of the Sporties free webinar series on a topic that is certainly popular. We know that by the registration. It's a full classroom tonight, and that's how to pass your Checkride. I should say how to prepare and pass your Checkride. I have to say I'm so thankful that my old friend Jason Blair is on with me tonight. And when we first started talking about this concept and this particular topic, my mind went immediately to Jason Blair. I just cannot think of another individual in general aviation that's better suited or more qualified to be talking on the topic of check rides. For those of you who don't know Jason, Jason's a very active single and multi-engine instructor, and of course an FAA Designated Pilot Examiner. These numbers are probably old, but I know Jason has well over 5,000 hours total time, more than 3,000 hours of instruction given, and I'm assuming his check ride, and Jason, you can jump in here, the number I have is over 800 pilot certificates conferred, but I know as busy as you are with multiple check rides given this week, that number has grown probably substantially. Jason, welcome.
You know, as of today, the number's 1,179 with two fresh issuances today, a commercial single engine add-on and a fresh private pilot to our ranks as aviation here. So glad to be here with you tonight. Glad to have gotten a couple people their licenses, I guess their certificates and ratings here today, and looking forward to talking more about how we make sure people get through these check rides successfully tonight with you.
Fantastic. You know, the topic of check rides stirs up so much emotion in all of us, and it's nothing as aviators we can get away from, and I don't know that anyone could probably say they enjoy being evaluated, but that's just a part of the process. And I know a lot of the good DPEs I know, and Jason's in that category, they understand when you're coming into that check ride that there's a flight instructor behind that endorsement who's spent a lot of time with you and has done so much evaluation and mentoring along the way. They understand that you've met these qualifications, and their job is not to start you at fail, and it's your job to convince them that you're there to pass, you deserve to pass. It's quite the opposite. They're going in with the assumption that you've met all these requirements, you've met the standards, and go out there and show them what you can do. And Jason's going to give us a lot of tangible takeaways, some quality insight that you can walk away with and feel very good about your next check ride, no matter where you are in the process, because you never get away from that process in aviation. Before we kind of get into the core of the content tonight, just a few housekeeping items. I already offered on behalf of Sporties Pilot Shop our thanks for joining us. Wanted to let everyone know that tonight's presentation on check rides is being recorded. So not to worry if you do have to step away for a moment, if you happen to miss a point that was made or a slide, you will be able to come back in the next day or so and view that in the Sporties webinar archives at sporties.com/webinars, or also on the Sporties YouTube channel, and you can view that as much as you'd like. We will also periodically be taking questions. We'll have a dedicated question and answer session at the very end of the presentation, but we may break in from time to time too, to field a few from the audience. So feel free via the webinar software that's in front of you to submit the questions at any time throughout the presentation. And again, we will get through those as the presentation goes on. Talk to you a little bit about Jason Blair. A little about myself. I serve as the president and chief instructor at Sporties Academy. That's the education division of Sporties. I'm an airline transport pilot and flight instructor, and also a NAFI designated master instructor. We have a fleet of about 17 aircraft and work with a client base down at Sporties. You can see that in the background there, of about 120 to 150 clients really at any given time. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention if there's anything that Sporties can do for you, either from a supply point of view or also a flight training point of view, whether it's finishing up you know, that course of training that's been ongoing or starting something fresh and new. We'd be delighted to have you down to our campus for a few weeks to work with you in whatever that may be, from primary all the way up through multi-CFI, even ATP. A few resources, if you were not aware, that are available from Sporty's anytime to assist you in this process. And tonight's presentation is not just that Checkride step, but also about that entire preparation, that entire journey working up to the Checkride. There's a lot of fantastic resources out there to enhance your overall learning experience and also just help you remain a part of that aviation community. It's widely accepted that the more involved you are in the local community and the more support that you have, and that can come in the form of your personal support network, your friends and your family, but also that pilot network, those other pilots that are in the exact same place as you in that flight training process, or those who have just been there recently. They can offer so much camaraderie and so much support and give you so much, motivation and key insight as to what they're experiencing. You can help each other out because everyone experiences those minor learning plateaus at different points along the way, but everyone will experience it, so you can get a lot of support that way. Visit sportys.com for any of your educational needs, for any of your pilot resources, and also, again, if we can assist in any way from a flight training perspective, do visit us at sportysacademy.com to learn a little bit more about what we can do for you. Wanted to mention a few other resources, valuable resources, and this could be a topic in and of itself, but a few key ones and a few industry associations that if you're not familiar with, you absolutely should be, and be familiar with all those great assets that they have available not only on their website but in print form. Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, largest advocacy group for pilots, of course, protecting our freedom to fly, AOPA.org. The Air Safety Institute, which is part of AOPA, a lot of great resources on there, including Flight Training Magazine, videos, articles, and information on about any particular topic related to aviation you can imagine. So a lot of great free resources there, even if you're not a member, but absolutely everyone should be a member. And also Experimental Aircraft Association, EAA.org, if you're looking again to involve yourself in a local quality aviation chapter, aviation group. Experimental Aircraft Association is a great place to start. There are local chapters at airports all across the country, and again on their website, EAA.org, you can find a lot of great support resources similar to AOPA. I mentioned Student Pilot News as a resource that's also available kind of within the Sporty's domain. That's a website maintained and controlled by Sporty's, but that's exclusively both products and information predominantly to assist you in this flight training process. Flight school directory can be found there. A lot of great video tips that are refreshed on a regular basis. An ongoing flight training blog. We have weekly video tips. We have weekly fun flying videos because everyone needs to take a step back, take a deep breath, and just enjoy that aviation community around you, and you can do part of that at studentpilotnews.com. Also, iPadPilotNews.com and AirFaxJournal.com are two other online periodicals in the Sporty's family of online journals that if you haven't taken a look at, you absolutely should. These are free resources. They include a newsletter. iPad Pilot News is dedicated to anything iPad related, which we know has quickly taken over the aviation community. I'm sure most of the people online here with us tonight are probably using the iPad as an EFB. And you have a lot of other resources available there. And also airfaxjournal.com for the active aviation community out there. This is a set of articles, videos that are submitted by users. This is a user-driven group here, so you can get some great feedback. You can participate yourself. You can kind of explore and see and help share in some of the successes and many of the challenges that other aviators just like you experience on a day in and day out basis. Before we turn things over to Jason, I wanted to talk just for a moment about some of the preparation that's involved in a successful flight training journey that will inevitably turn into a successful Checkride experience. And it all starts with having a good foundation from which to build. And in this modern day, there's so many great resources out there to help you when you're away from the airport and help you learn on your own and use your own style and use different media, take advantage of all those great delivery options we have now, whether it's online or dedicated app. But starting with an online course is definitely a great foundation to start with, where you can kind of wrap that ground school component into a very personalized learning experience that you can do on your own time, at your convenience, at the home, at the office, on the go, whatever the case may be. It's certainly, widely accepted that the more senses you can involve in that learning process, the more powerful experience it's going to be, and the more that information and the better that information is going to be retained. You can see some of these flight procedures brought to life. So this is as good a preparation as you can get outside of full motion simulator with some of the HD quality video that you can get in an online course platform. Doing so will have you better prepared for each flight lesson and each ground lesson, and in the end that will absolutely save you time and money. There's no doubt about it. When you can spend less time in the briefing room and more time doing, that is going to equate to a smoother, more enjoyable, more efficient flight training process for all involved. And keep in mind, this is just a means to an end. We're here not to flight train, we're here to be pilots. We're here for what's on the other end of that pilot certificate, and this will help you do it. And also that, the industry is certainly working hard. I'm not sure we'll ever fully get there to what I would say fixing the written testing function, although it's getting much better with the introduction of the airman certification standards. But there's still a little bit of a disconnect we have. I think everyone understands that between written testing and actual practical flight training and flying. And some of these standalone written test preparation modules that you can obtain with an online course can also do wonders in preparing you for that and kind of getting that segment of the training behind you so you can focus on the task at hand, and that is flying in the airplane. I will make a quick mention with all of that that we certainly value you giving Sporties a shot if you're not already using some form of an online ground school or online curriculum. The Sporties Learn to Fly course available at sporties.com/courses features 13 hours of video content and training and several dedicated modules including written test prep, some flight resources including an interactive maneuvers guide, a flight syllabus, which is a key component of a successful experience, so you always have a plan of action, you always know where you've been and where you are going, and you can also earn your written exam endorsement directly from that course. Few last minute tips I will add is own your flight training experience. That's my takeaway. For if you don't remember anything else from me tonight, you're gonna remember a lot from Jason. If you don't remember anything else that I mentioned tonight, remember I said this: own your own experience, take control. Don't be passive. You must be active. You must be just as involved in that curriculum and that syllabus as the flight instructor. You need to be looking ahead. You need to be seeing what's out there that's unknown and go out and take the initiative to learn something about it. So again, when you get to the airport, you can hit the ground running, less time briefing, more time flying. That's a quicker, more efficient path to a pilot certificate. Understand there will be obstacles. Don't let continuity be one of those. When you start breaking up lessons and when you go weeks or even months in some cases without flight training, that's just extra time that's going to need to be spent to get you right back to where you just were. Continuity is key. If there are obstacles and challenges, find a way around them. Maybe that's finding some online resources, an article, maybe another pilot. Maybe it's another flight instructor that can add a slightly different voice or some different perspective on a maneuver. Own the experience, find a way around it. With that, it is indeed my pleasure to welcome again Mr. Jason Blair, who's going to take things over here as we make a quick handoff behind the scenes, and he's going to talk to us about Checkride preparation. Jason, it's all yours.
Well, thanks much, Eric, and glad to be here with everybody tonight. And as I said earlier, this is I actually did 2 check rides today, so this is not something that we only do periodically. It's what I call check ride season up here in the Upper Midwest. For the folks on the call here and listening who are in places where you have better weather, our winter months get a little bit quiet, and in this time of the year we get nice and busy. And I think, Eric, you got the same thing down there in the Cincinnati area, where our weather makes an effect on these check rides. So glad to be getting through a bunch of these, and glad to talk with everybody tonight as we talk about how you can kind of prepare for and pass your check ride. And we'll call it an FAA practical test, but refer to it as a check ride, which is pretty much what we all refer to it as we go through tonight. So looking forward to sharing some things that I have seen on check rides, and things that I've seen as an instructor and as an examiner that help you be more prepared to be successful on that check ride. And it really begins with understanding what is the purpose of the practical test in the first place. So when we think about a practical test, it's not a way to trick you or trap you or find a way to stop you from being a pilot. It's really the last in a series of tests that everybody takes along their training for a pilot certificate or a rating, and it's just a way to kind of check to make sure the instructor that you've been working with and the studying that you have been doing ensures that you've met the standards for the particular rating or certificate that you are pursuing. So in effect, we're really there, like Eric said earlier, to not necessarily try and test you. We're there just to kind of make sure the things that you have been trained on meet the standards, and we're a verification that the work the instructor has already done with you meets those standards, and you can continue to meet those standards as a pilot, as an outside check is really what we're there for. All of these tests are done in accordance with a minimum standard that the FAA sets forth. It's, in this case, most of them are now going to be airman certification standards as of June 12th. We now have private instrument and commercial airman certification standards. There are still a couple of practical test standards that are applicable that will be changing over time, primarily the CFI and the ATP, and actually the sport pilot and recreational, I think, are still out there as PTS, Eric, if I'm not mistaken, too. So I'm not certain when the sport pilot and recreational are going to be updated, but the CFI will be coming soon as well, probably next June when it comes out. So the examiner is going to use those documents to evaluate the applicant on the test. We're not here to retest the airman's knowledge test. We're here just to test that practical portion of the check ride and make sure that the standards that are set forth in those ACS or PTS standards are what you're going to be tested to. So that really is your menu for the check ride, and that's what we have to follow as an examiner as well. Now, everybody gets to a check ride, and the first thing they think is, all right, when's he going to start the questioning? And the reality is there are 4 or 5, in essence, major portions of the check ride. And it doesn't start with locking you in a room and asking you a bunch of questions. It actually starts with making sure you are qualified to take the test. And this is one of the jobs of the examiner, is to make sure that we have gone through the applicant's information to make sure that they have everything completed that meets the FAA standards for the particular rating or certificate. And these are things that we do find errors in sometimes. It might be that we're missing 0.2 hours of nighttime, or we got 9 takeoffs and landings at night instead of the 10 that are required for a private pilot certificate. So our job is to make sure the applicant is ready for the check ride. So when you first get to meet with the examiner, they're going to take some time and go through your logbooks, make sure you have the proper medical certificates that are required for the rating or certificate, make sure the endorsements are all there for that check ride. And this is going to take some time, and obviously the whole time you're waiting for the examiner to do this, you're getting more and more nervous, right? As you wait to try and see, is the examiner gonna get going on this, and am I gonna pass? And this is actually a good time for you just to take a little bit of a breather and relax and work with the examiner to show them the documents that are required to make sure you're eligible for that check ride. Another part of that is they're also going to make sure they go through your application for that check ride, which is typically done on the IACRA website, which is a digital application processing site. In rare cases, we do get stuck doing paper yet, but we certainly try to get that done as early as possible in the digital format. If everything meets the requirements, once that's done, the examiner is required to actually give you a briefing about the test. So they're going to brief you on, what to expect, that we're going to have an oral and a flight portion of the check ride, what to do if you have questions during the check ride, approximately how long it generally takes, even little things like we have to tell you if you want a bathroom break, you can do it. So, these are all things that we're going to brief you about before we even begin the check ride. So the reality is, once we've done these two things, you're probably already about a half hour or so into the time you're going to spend with that examiner. So once that is done, we're going to finally get into the oral questioning. And depending on the type of test that's being given, it's generally going to be between an hour and a half or 2 hours of time, and it's going to be covering the areas that are in the PTS or ACS. So those are areas that are specifically designed to make sure that we have practically applied the information that you previously learned for the knowledge test in relation to what we're going to be doing on the actual practical test that day. Now, a few of these do get shorter. For example, I did a commercial single engine add-on practical test this week. It's a very short ground portion. Many times it's less than an hour because somebody already has a commercial pilot certificate. So in a few cases, they'll be very, very short, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything's wrong if you get through things quickly. It just means you did your job studying. Once the oral portion of the practical test has been completed successfully, you'll proceed into the flight demonstration portion of this. And in most check rides, this is going to take an hour and a half to 2 hours. It certainly shouldn't be long enough that you're going to need to refuel or anything like that. When we do see CFI check rides, they obviously take longer. But generally, if you add these two things up, you're going to probably have about a 5-hour time period that you're spending with the examiner. And I like to tell my applicants, we're not going to lock you in a room with the CIA and waterboard you for 5 hours. It just takes time to go through this stuff. So as we go through this is what somebody can generally expect for the order of the practical test that they're going to take. And I got a little note down here. The examiner obviously loves to do these check rides. We absolutely love to see people get their ratings and certificates completed. But we also generally do it for a fee, and the examiner is supposed to collect that fee prior to the beginning of the actual testing portion. So that would happen after the qualification and briefing has been completed, and they'll accept their payment then and move on into the testing portion. So if we think about just preparing for the test itself, now that we know what we are going to be doing on the practical test, let's talk a little bit about some of the things you can do to prepare for it. And one of the things that I really like to kind of get people to think about is considering the scheduling and the timing at which they're going to take that test. If you're somebody that doesn't like to get up early in the morning or perhaps works late, maybe an early morning check ride is not a great idea. Now, on the other side of that, maybe you are a morning person and you like to wake up at 5 o'clock, have that first cup of coffee, and meeting the examiner at 7 a.m. is the best thing you can do to get that day started and get it moving. So think about your own personal scheduling and how that's going to affect when you want to schedule the check ride. Certainly there's some coordination that has to happen with the examiner so the two of you can coordinate together, but if you do have some choices, maybe you don't want to just take the first available time, but instead pick a time that's going to best fit your schedule and the examiner's, that also is a time of the day that works well for you.
Jason, if I could interject for a second.
Absolutely.
What would be the advice? Would you recommend you hitting that head on with the examiner if clearly there's a high energy time of day when you're performing best? Is it best to just let the examiner know that, I understand I might have to wait a little bit longer to schedule with you, but this is really my peak performance time of day, and I'd really like to, get it in as best I can, around this particular time? Is that the best way to handle it?
It is, absolutely, and I can tell you I had a gentleman about 2 weeks ago, we did a check ride 4, and it got weathered out, and I called him and said, hey, and last minute, I've got 2 days from now, I got an opening, can you do the morning? And he was very honest with me. He said, that's great. He said, but I work line for Delta Airlines. Our last flight comes in at 12:30 in the morning, and I just don't think I'm going to be awake and ready to perform well at 7 in the morning. And I think that's an absolutely valid thing to tell the examiner. If you have a best time of the day that's going to work for you, be honest with the examiner and tell them that. That shows good pilot decision making, that you're going to make those decisions when you're going to fly on your own as well. So, the same holds true. We have the after work game. A lot of people say, well, I work till 3 o'clock. It's not dark till 9 o'clock this time of the year. Maybe I can squeeze it in before the end of the day. And boy, if you had a full day of work and you're trying to juggle a couple things and get there on the last minute, and maybe that flight planning isn't quite done yet, you're already kind of putting yourself behind the 8 ball to get that check ride done and be at your best peak performance, which is exactly what we want to do on the day of our test. So, can you schedule it on a weekend, on a day off? Think about when does it get dark. I can tell you from a long time ago, I did a check ride and the applicant hadn't thought about when it got dark, and he was convinced we were going to do a private pilot check ride. And the flight portion put us about 7 o'clock in the evening in December in Michigan. Boy, it was dark. And, we had a conversation before, and I said, "You sure you want to do this?" He said, "Yeah, I think I can do it." Well, the first thing we tried was turns around a point. So it's pretty hard to see a turn in the dark, or point to do a turnaround in the dark. He chose a moving car light set, which was interesting to me, but it didn't work out so well. So, thinking about that, scheduling can be a big factor in setting yourself up to be successful on that check ride. And leaving yourself enough time to get to the airport ahead of the examiner. And this is one thing I'm very careful of when I do practical tests. I try not to show up significantly early on the applicant. If we have a 9 a.m. check ride scheduled, I might show up at 8:45, but I'm certainly not going to show up at 7 a.m. and leave the person who's trying to get their last minute planning done feeling very pressured. So give yourself some time to get to the airport, get those last minute things set up, maybe get the aircraft logbooks dug out, and make sure everything is ready for that check ride. So if you don't want to do that at 6 in the morning, might not be a great idea to schedule a 7 a.m. check ride. Or maybe you can prepare some of those things the night before and have them ready to be, ready to go. And I guess here, when we think about this also is go back to the last slide. We talked about how long it's going to take. Make sure you set enough time apart to be able to complete the entire check ride in that time period. A lot of times we have check rides that maybe we'll schedule it at noon and somebody says, but I got to be at class at 3 p.m. or I've got to be at work at 3 p.m. or pick the kids up from school. 3 hours isn't going to do it. We're probably going to need 5 hours, and maybe a little extra time would be good to plan. So make sure when you schedule your check ride that you have enough time, to get there early, prepare, and leave enough time to complete the whole practical test. And even if there's any hiccups that happen along the way, some of those we can run into relate to whether the aircraft is ready. And there's many, many times that we find we get to a check ride and we run into hiccups with the aircraft. Certainly the aircraft in the picture here is probably not the one we want to use for a check ride, but I can't tell you I have been too far off from seeing airplanes like this brought to check rides sometimes. The reality is when we as an examiner conduct a practical test, we also have to ensure that we are getting into an aircraft that is airworthy and meets all the FAA standards. Now, we're not APs typically, we're not IAs, we're not going to do a full inspection on the aircraft, but we do certainly need to see the basics to make sure that aircraft is ready. We're going to need to see the logbooks for the aircraft to make sure that the annual inspection and VORs, if they're applicable, and all the airworthiness type of inspections are completed and that the aircraft is legal for flight. So those inspections are going to have to be demonstrated to us. We do need to see if there are airworthiness directives that are applicable, that they're complied with, and if there are any reoccurring ADs that they have been kept current. Some real common ones that we run into are seat brackets on the Cessna aircraft. Many aircraft out there have heater inspections that have to be done, and these have to be done in certain time periods. These are also great questions that we ask on the practical test ground portion of it, the oral portion of the test, to make sure the applicant can qualify the aircraft and show us that it is appropriately able to be flown that day as well. Now, the general gist is we also can't have things that are broken, and certainly on aircraft we know there are some things that can be placarded and made and disabled if they're not airworthiness related items. If you've got an old NDB in the aircraft that isn't going to be functional for the check ride, that's perfectly fine, but we probably can't have the flaps not working on the airplane or an alternator not working, something like that. So if we find things like this that are missing or broken, we are not going to be able to proceed with the test. It doesn't mean that you failed, it just means we can't do the test that day and it will need to be rescheduled. So taking the time ahead of the check ride to make sure that an aircraft is ready is something that can make the day of the check ride go faster, more smooth, and make sure you actually get the check ride, because invariably the day that we hold up a check ride for an aircraft is going to be the most beautiful day to do it, and when you reschedule it's probably going to have lousy weather, right? So it's kind of how it seems to work. So, so take the time, and we do understand if something does break. You know, if you're using an aircraft and somebody flew it the day before and something broke, you know, give us a call and let us know if there's a problem for the check ride that next day, and we can work with a reschedule. But when we find things that are missing, or if we find 100-hour inspections that are overflown, these are things that are going to hold the check ride up and make you need to reschedule. As we think about personal documents that are going to be needed to have with on the day of the practical test, there's actually quite a few things that you need to have completed. I mentioned earlier the IACRA application. It's actually an FAA 8710. It's an airman certificate and rating application. It's basically the application that the applicant and the instructor complete and send off to the examiner. We look at that, and then we ship it all off to Oklahoma City when we're done and have passed you, and that's what gets the certificate moving through the FAA system. So that document must be completed. There are times when we cannot use IACRA in some cases if there's a system outage, or in cases of seaplane ratings where maybe we're doing it at a local lake and there's just not access to internet. Sometimes we use paper. It's also a good idea, if you have completed this in IACRA prior to your test, go ahead and print a copy and bring it with you. If we get there on the day of the check ride and find that the IACRA system happens to be down or there's an internet outage, at least we're able to continue with the test, because that is an application that's required for us to be able to proceed with the test. It's worth noting that we also have to make sure all the requirements are completed. We alluded to it earlier, you know, whether we have all our night takeoffs and landings, or maybe all of our cross-country time. These are things the examiner has to look through the applicant's logbook and make sure that the requirements for that particular test are completed. And if they're not, we again don't get to continue with the test. Certainly need to have your medical, or in this case at this point, compliance with I guess the basic med process does need to be with you. We need to see that you are currently medically qualified if applicable for the test. We need to see a photo ID. It's got to be a government issued photo ID. Most commonly is passport or driver's license, things like that. But certainly military ID and things like that can work as well. We need to see your knowledge test report for many of the practical tests. So in some of the add-ons, we don't need them, but many of them we do need to see that. And that is something your instructor would also need to have completed in IACRA when they sign you off for the practical test. In some cases, we need a graduation certificate, and this is primarily applicable for Part 141 training, if there's a graduation certificate. And we need endorsements. So it's a requirement that we need to see somebody is able to fly the aircraft that they're going to be using for the practical test, especially on private pilot tests where they have to have been able to solo that aircraft. For commercial tests, things like that, we may need a high performance endorsement or a complex endorsement, and these are all things that must be there in the logbooks for the individual taking the test to be able to continue forward with that. And then for every practical test that's given, the instructor will be signing off a series of endorsements that include the test, and that they've reviewed the areas found deficient on a knowledge test, and that they have flown with the applicant at least 3 hours in the preceding 2 calendar months. So all of those things have to be in there for us to be able to even proceed with the test, and these are things that can be prepared ahead of time. It's a good idea, if you have any questions about these or whether you meet any of these requirements, to go ahead and take a look through these ahead of time, not just the morning of the check ride. And if you have questions, give the examiner a call, and they can certainly help try to make sure you're going to be able to get that check ride done on the day of if there's any documentary compliance that needs to be addressed. It's worth noting here, I also say bring reference materials. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through it. So as we think about all these things that need to be with us, really any of these items being missed with you are really a reason that's going to cause your test to not go. And probably the most common one I'm going to mention is something to pay attention to, is a name mismatch on any of these documents. Technically, we need to see a photo ID that matches the same first name, middle name, last name, or whichever choice you're going to be using on the knowledge test report and the IACRA application. And if there are previous pilot certificates that are held, it does need to match there. If they do not match, you know, for example, if your medical has first name, last name instead of first name, middle name, last name, and your knowledge test has the other one, and your photo ID has a junior at the end of it, these are actually paperwork items that are going to stop the check ride from going forward. So take the time to go through these things prior to the test and make sure any hiccups are addressed to make sure you're going to be able to get going forward into the actual portion of the test. Let's talk about that a little bit. Unless, Eric, any questions so far you want to add in there? All right, hearing none, we're going to. Oh, you got one there?
No, I think we're rolling along pretty well, Jason.
All right, let's dive into the ground portion here. So this is the first part where the examiner is going to lock you in the room, tie you down, and start questioning you, right? It's actually not that bad, fortunately. But I will tell you, you do have to have a good location for it. You know, the picture here in this is probably not the best place and actually would get us in trouble as an examiner. We try not to do a check ride in the middle of the FBO at the main table with people going by. Really, we're given guidance as examiners. We're supposed to have an undisturbed location that's, you know, basically four walls and a closed door. It's a good idea, in my recommendation, to have a nice large work surface for any charting, a computer available if you're going to be doing any of the IACR work, a whiteboard or a chalkboard, something you can draw on. I'll tell you, a lot of people, when I do check rides, draw out things like aircraft systems, maybe write down some lists, the mnemonics that we use for memorize things. I always tell people I don't judge their drawing abilities because my artistic talent certainly doesn't come up to par. But whatever it takes to help you be more prepared and easily able to have a good undisturbed location with the resources you need is something you should plan ahead for and make sure it's available for your check ride. This is going to keep it from being, you know, disturbed in the middle as somebody walks into the FBO and starts asking questions. And it's going to make sure you have a good, clear communication process between you and the examiner. It's worth knowing what is actually going to be tested. I mentioned it earlier, the Airman Certification Standards or the Practical Test Standards are really the menu for the test that the examiner is going to be using. This is actually what we have to test on. We're not going to test you on more than's in there. We're not going to make up new stuff, but we do have to at least cover the minimum items that the ACS or PTS require us to cover for that particular practical test. It is amazing how many times people come to check rides and they have no copy of this with them. And in some cases, you know, we look at the instrument rating ACS down here. That instrument rating ACS is also a resource that could be used to determine what needs to be completed on an instrument proficiency check. So if we're asking an instrument pilot candidate or a CFII candidate what must be completed on a instrument proficiency check, that's a good reference document that they should have with them to be able to refer to and come up with the answers of what needs to be on an IPC. So certainly worth having these documents with you, and obviously very, very much worth going through them with your instructor and on your own prior to the test to know exactly what's going to be tested on the practical test. It's also worth knowing that you should have the owner's manual or operating handbook or POH for the aircraft as well. Sometimes the owner's manuals or POHs for those aircraft do offer different interpretations or more restrictive standards on how you will perform a maneuver than the PTS. For example, the PTS in a multi-engine check ride will recommend that we stay at least 3,000 feet above ground level for any multi-engine simulated failures. If we look at some aircraft, many Piper aircraft, and particularly the Piper Twin Comanche, recommend 4,000 or 5,000 AGL. So the examiner should be making sure they not only adhere to the PTS or ACS, but also if there are any more restrictive limitations that the aircraft manufacturer has put on the aircraft for performance of some of those maneuvers. So it's worth making sure you look through the POH or airplane flight handbook, whatever it happens to be, to make sure that you're adhering to any additional standards that are beyond the PTS. If we think about the reference materials, you know, this is something that many people think, boy, we can't look anything up on a check ride, right? Well, you certainly can. The examiner may give you an opportunity to look up some information. We certainly don't expect you to memorize everything. I can't tell you that I've memorized everything either, and that's part of being a good pilot is continuing to learn and also knowing where to find reference materials if we need them. Always good to have a current copy of the FARs with you. I mentioned the ACS and PTS, but also give yourself a chance to bring what other reference materials you may use with you for that test. And if there is an opportunity where maybe you're not entirely certain on something, but you think you know where to find it, tell the examiner, look, I'm not really clear on this one. I think I know exactly where to find it, and show them that you would be able to find that information. A great example of this that I many times ask on practical tests is what the owner-operator maintenance allowances are, and this is something that's in the Part 43 Appendix A. There's a big list of things that we can do, and I might ask somebody, geez, you know, if the landing light burns out on your airplane, can you change it as a pilot? And I don't expect the pilot to memorize that whole list. This is certainly something that you would identify on the ground, and if they had a question, they could go refer to their FARs and determine if the landing light is something they can change. Fortunately for us, it is, but there are certainly things we also cannot do, and this would give us an opportunity as a pilot to determine what that's going to be. As a pilot, you're going to do that in real life. This is a practical test. I expect nothing different on the test itself. So if there's something you would normally be looking up on the ground as a pilot, you have the opportunity to do the same thing on a practical test. But it gets really hard to do it if you don't have the materials with you. So as we go through the ground portion, you know, I think one of the biggest things I tell people is think of it like a conversation. Imagine the ground portion of the Checkride is really just a conversation about flying. You know, imagine you're with a friend who knows nothing about aviation. They're very curious, and you know, it's going to take some time to explain things. If you imagine you sat down over dinner with a friend and they said, gee, what do flaps do? It would take you some time to explain that, and this is why the ground portion takes an hour and a half or 2 hours to get through. The examiner's not looking to trap you. They're not looking to trick you. They're just looking to see, do you have the basic knowledge that's required to understand how things like systems work, how the regulations apply to your flight, things like airspace and flight planning, and it's going to take some time to go through that. So if you treat the ground portion of the test like a conversation, and just kind of have a conversation with the examiner when they ask questions, it's really going to be a lot more comfortable for you instead of just a rote question and answer session. So that's probably the best advice I have for the ground portion of the test in terms of how you're going to approach the test itself. A couple general tips on the ground portion. It's always a good idea to draw, explain, or write things down if you can, and this is where having the whiteboard can help you. Many times as we draw things out or explain them or write them down, it helps clarify our own thoughts, and as we do it, we take the time to really collect our thoughts before we just spit out an answer. One of the things that we do encounter as examiners is an attempt to slow people down on the check rides. When we ask a question, there's a natural reaction to want to answer that immediately, and there's nothing wrong with taking a little time to write down, to collect your thoughts, or work through that answer a little bit before you give us a final answer on it. So take your time as you go through it. Don't just spit out that first answer, and if you need to, don't be afraid to take a break either. So you know, we certainly don't expect you to be locked to the chair while we're questioning for a couple hours. If you want a break for some water or bathroom break, you know, feel free to tell the examiner, let's take a 5-minute break. I'm going to use the restroom quick and come on back. And there's a good chance if the examiner is like me and drank a couple cups of coffee on the way to the practical test, they're gonna welcome that break as well. So back to the reference materials, make sure you've got those POH diagrams with you as well. This is something I actually see sometimes not with on practical tests. So it is kind of important to make sure you have that resource with you. We are going to be using that as a reference portion for the performance sections of the ground portion of the Checkride. So let's imagine we get all the way through the ground portion, we've gotten through the testing, everything that's in that ACS or PTS is completed, and we're going to move on to the flight portion of the test at this point. So I want to kind of highlight the role of the examiner on the practical test. We're really there as an examiner, not as an instructor. We're not another pilot that's on board unless we happen to be doing a practical test in an aircraft that requires 2 crew. You know, if we get into the jet environment, there are some examiners doing those types of operations, but the majority of practical tests, the pilot in command is the person who's taking the test. So, you know, it's fair to say you can use the examiner as a knowledgeable passenger, but we do expect you to brief us like you would a normal passenger who wasn't completely familiar with the aircraft. You know, you could have us look for some traffic a little bit. You can have us hold the charts a little bit. Maybe, you know, in the summer we'll hold our door open for a little bit of cooler air. You can expect us to act as a normal passenger might, but not as a crew member for your aircraft. And I think that's an important thing that makes a big difference on practical tests. And that's a part of what we're testing, is to make sure you are the PIC on that flight. We're testing to make sure that you're going to make good decisions from the start of that flight till the very end of it, and show us that you could go out and do this on your own with family and friends or by yourself, as if there was not an examiner or an instructor with you. And I guess to highlight that point, Eric mentioned, I think I'm a little over 52 or 5,300 hours of logged flight time right now, but I'm a little over 2,000 hours of riding in an airplane as an examiner, and we do not log any of the flight time as an examiner unless we happen to become a PIC moment in the aircraft, which is typically if we have to do an actual instrument check ride in instrument conditions. Otherwise, we really are just passengers along the way, and we're looking for you as the applicant on that check ride to show us you can be the PIC of that airplane and conduct the maneuvers that you're testing for. So that's a really important part of the check ride, and it's kind of hard as the applicant to not think of the guy in the right seat or the gal in the right seat as somebody who's knowledgeable and experienced. They're there to test you, right? And you think of them as somebody that you should refer to in that role, but they're really not there to do that day. So be a good PIC, and that's going to be a big part of your check ride. So on the ground portion, it's pretty important to conduct a thorough pre-flight inspection. And this is a little awkward sometimes. The examiner is going to watch you conduct that pre-flight. We're not going to just sit there silent. We may ask you some questions about the aircraft. And certainly if it's an aircraft that we're not familiar with in terms of the particular make and not the make and model, but the particular N number, many times as examiners, we show up to do a check ride at an airport for somebody in an airplane we've never seen before. So we'll ask some questions about the airplane and how it's maintained, and if we see anything that piques our interest that looks like it's wrong, we're certainly going to ask some questions about that too. So make sure the aircraft is ready. We want to make sure that little things like the oil cap's back on tight. I've seen that on a check ride where we didn't get that all the way back on, and it certainly creates a heck of a mess. Missing little things can make a big difference on that check ride day when you're pre-flighting, and it's easy to get nervous and want to just get moving. And things like chocks and extension cords and tie downs do get left sometimes, and I got to tell you, it's a little entertaining for me as the examiner when we do hop into the airplane, and I've noticed the chocks are still in there, and we get all started up, and then we don't move very well, and I kind of get that moment of asking the applicant, so what do you think's happening? And usually, almost always, the applicant remembers what it was, and they shut down and go out and fix it, and that's one way to handle it. In one case, I can tell you the applicant decided to jump the chocks instead, purposefully knowing it was there, and we stopped the check ride immediately at that point. So, think about these little things and make sure that aircraft is thoroughly pre-flighted. And a good thing to do is just before you get in the airplane, take a 15 or 20 foot step back and just give it a good look over and make sure there's not one big last thing that you happen to be missing. To do a good thorough pre-flight, you do have to know the airplane a little bit. Study those aircraft systems, know how they work. This is a common portion on the ground and flight portion that we do run into troubles with. I can tell a story from a fellow examiner who had an applicant come up for the check ride. It was a commercial check ride, and when he got there, he talked to the examiner and said, geez, do you know how the gear goes down and up and down on this? I've never flown this airplane before. He was actually jumping into an airplane that he had never flown before on the day of his check ride, and that's certainly about the worst thing you can probably do in terms of knowing the airplane. So make sure that you do know the aircraft systems, but also know where to find things in the aircraft. Be organized, and as we jump between airplanes sometimes, we might be doing our training in a Piper Warrior or a Cessna 172, but switching particular airplanes. And unless the fleet is completely standardized where we're training, things may be slightly different. There might be a different radio, there might be a different GPS, maybe a couple of the switches are in a different spot. And if you're going to do a practical test in an aircraft, it'd be a really good idea to make sure you identify the particulars of that aircraft prior to the test and know where everything is, so you're not searching for it on the day of the test. So know that instrument panel, know the avionics work, know how to turn the radio on and the intercom. I can tell you there have been a number of check rides that I've gotten into and the intercom was turned off, and an applicant thought the radios weren't working. So, take the time to know these little details. It's going to make the examiner be a lot more comfortable if you seem to know the aircraft itself and where everything is in it. It's not the day where you should have to be asking the examiner how something works on the aircraft itself. So As we continue, make sure you know the standards for the maneuvers and what you will be required to demonstrate. I mentioned it earlier, review that POH if there are any limitations on the maneuvers. The Airplane Flying Handbook has descriptions of all of the maneuvers that you're going to do, and they are referred to from the ACS and PTS standards. So the ACS and PTS do have maneuver standards, but then the descriptions for those maneuvers are in the Airplane Flying Handbook. And if you don't have a copy of it, certainly you can pick one up from Sporty's, but they are also downloadable in PDF format from the FAA website. These are FAA publications, and I think you'll see a trend here when we do practical tests. Everything is very much based on FAA standards, and the same holds true for the maneuvers that we're going to be asking you to demonstrate on the day of a practical test. So take the time well ahead of the check ride to know those maneuvers, know the standards, have read through them, and understand what you are going to be required to demonstrate on the practical test. It's not a good time to start experimenting on the test. If you have done your training and something was missed in your training, it's not a good time to just try it and experiment. Last summer, I went to do a practical test. It was a private pilot test, and the applicant was unclear of the fact that we had to demonstrate an emergency descent on the private pilot test. I asked him what he would want to do. He said, "I'll try it anyway." Well, he was trying to do a maneuver that he wasn't trained to do, was unfamiliar with, and it really didn't get done in the way that the POH in that case and the Airplane Flying Handbook described. So, making sure that you understand all the maneuvers is important, but if there is something you don't know, don't try and just make it up on the check ride. It's better to tell the examiner, "I'm not familiar with that," and don't just try anyway. With that being said, there are some maneuvers that can be modified slightly or changed a little bit depending on how you're trained and still meet PTS. There are a couple maneuvers that can be done multiple ways. So if you have heard an examiner likes it a certain way, don't change that on the day of your test. Do the maneuvers how you've been trained to do them, no matter what you think the examiner might want or prefer. If they do meet the practical test standards, it's going to be an item that you pass on. During the flight portion, it's also important to take your time, and certainly we can't fly all day. Eventually we'll run out of gas, but if we fueled the aircraft appropriately, take the time to set those maneuvers up, and if it takes you 1.3, that's great. If it takes you 1.8 on the flight time, that's fine too. There's no rush on this. Many times I find students do fail because they rush a maneuver. They miss clearing turns. They don't set up the maneuver to have a gear down or a flaps down as appropriate, and they just forget to do stuff. So taking the time to set that maneuver up and not rushing is an important thing, and this is also true on instrument practical tests. A really good savvy student remembers the words delay vectors and takes the time, if they feel like they're getting jammed into an approach, to set themselves up and give themselves the time to appropriately do the maneuver that they're going to do. And I think this one's a simple one. Don't scare the examiner. I know it seems really logical, but the more predictable things are, the more you communicate with the examiner, the more the examiner is going to know that you understand what's happening on that test, and it keeps them pretty comfortable with what's going on. So, a general word is don't scare the examiner. I think that's pretty important, but a big part of how you make sure you don't scare them is to be communicative along the way on that flight portion as well. So as we think about this, we've got some general check ride tips that I do want to pass along as well, and then also I'll pass along a few things that are common failure items. When we think about a practical test, I do like to mention it's not a spectator sport. This is not the day when you want to bring your family and friends out to the airport. It's not the day that you want to plan on immediately after passing your private pilot test ride at 12:59 p.m. that at 1:05 p.m. you're going to get in the airplane and fly that first family trip all the way across the country. Set your day up as something you're going to do at the airport undisturbed, and you can go ahead and give your family and friends a call after when things have been completed successfully and tell them how things go. It just adds a lot of extra pressure to you on the day of the test to have those other individuals there while you're trying to get the check ride completed. It's worth noting you're going to make mistakes on a practical test. We expect this as examiners. We don't expect you to be perfect. Generally, we're looking for solid all-around performance, not not perfection, you know. We're looking to make sure that you generally know what's happening on this test, and if there are any errors, you know, perhaps we're off by 50 feet in a steep turn, but you're making good corrections. You understand how to fix that and get yourself back on track for your altitude. And sometimes this shows us just as much as examiners is as if we're going to do the maneuver perfectly. I mean, I don't fly perfectly as a pilot either. So being able to identify and correct your own examiners is an important thing to show the examiner that you're going to do this when you go out and do flying on your own. You know, if you do make a mistake, go ahead and explain it to the examiner. Tell them what you're doing to fix it. You know, a good explanation of a fix is really going to show you how to manage those issues if they do come up in your own flying. Now, I will admit, as an examiner, as things are going along perfectly well, we do get distracted, look out the window sometimes, and as the maneuvers are going on, some keywords like oops, uh-oh, and oh darn are good cues to bring us right back into that airplane. So if you do see something going on, you know, maybe avoid the oops, uh-oh, and oh darn, and just tell us what you're doing to fix it instead. So, you know, keep us feeling happy as we go through that flight. Do strive for your best performance. As we think about those FAA, ACS, and PTS standards, they are minimums. That's exactly what they are. This is basically, I got a D minus and I'm passing. You know, we want to get an A on this Checkride if we can. So strive to do the absolute best you can to exceed the minimum standards of those ACS and PTS documents and show us that the majority of the time you're going to be better than the absolute basic minimum. In some cases, this shows us, you know, if we have one maneuver that's a little bit rusty, but the rest of them are really good, as long as everything's within the PTS, we're certainly going to feel pretty happy about passing if everything looked good. We get a little bit nervous when everything is starting to be right on the ragged edge of that ACS or PTS standard. So strive for your best performance all the way through that test as you do it. It's worth noting, and this kind of comes back to the time scheduling, be rested. You know, a good night's sleep before the Checkride is an important thing, and that means don't spend the whole night before trying to cram information into your brain. The reality is when we think about how our brains work, cramming information doesn't give us a good retention ability for memory anyway. You're actually better off to go ahead and get a good night's sleep, and that way the information you have learned over the weeks and months of your study ahead is going to be accessible, and your brain is going to be functioning at peak performance, and you'll be well rested and able to perform on the day of that test. So generally being tired is something that will reduce your performance on that, and especially on the oral portion of the test can make it harder to retain and get that information out to the examiner coherently. I think Eric mentioned a little bit earlier about you know, using our electronic flight bags, and this is an interesting piece that has changed over the time when I have been an examiner. We've changed from having piles of charts with us to perhaps just an electronic flight bag. As we think about doing practical tests with digital charting and planning, it is something that's perfectly fine and acceptable on the test. It is worth talking to the examiner ahead of time. Some examiners are more comfortable or less comfortable with digital flight planning, but it is something the FAA has instructed examiners that we are to accept. So if you want to show up at the Checkride with just digital planning, that's perfectly fine and is acceptable as long as you can demonstrate that the planning information that you're going to be using on that device is such that it will, you know, meet all the ACS and PTS standards. So, you know, we're really there to test how you're going to fly. I say here, not how your grandpa did. You know, we want to see how you're actually going to fly in real life. And the reality is when I give practical tests, I certainly know that if somebody shows up with an electronic flight bag, they're going to be using that in their real life. To have them show up with a pile of paper charts when I can see the iPad on the desk next to them is not really validly testing how they're practically going to fly. So I'd rather see them use the digital charting. It is worth noting, have backups, a charger, a second device potentially. You know, even an iPhone, which is typically what I carry as my backup for my iPad. You know, I have the multiple little apps on there, and if one of them dies, I've got a backup. So as long as you have some sort of a backup option for the inevitable question the examiner may ask of, well, what if your battery dies? It gives you an option to work with it and have something else that you could rely upon if your primary device did fail. Could have a backup, you know, paper plan as well. A couple things I do like to ask about when we are using electronic flight bags is that individuals know how to replan a flight. So we may modify the flight a little bit, especially for instrument check rides. Maybe if ATC gave somebody a new routing. The reality is it's actually a lot easier on digital flight bags now than it ever used to be on the old paper form. So we can really do some great in-flight planning that we never were able to easily do historically. Some information is worth noting is more difficult to get on the electronic flight bag devices and the apps than it maybe was in previous ways that we got it. A good example of that is the airport facilities directory, or the chart supplements, I guess we'll call them now, that do need to be downloaded separately in most applications to make sure you have that data. So it's worth having a little bit of forethought to make sure you have all the charts that you're going to need, and potentially any supplemental information that does need to be downloaded, so you have access to that when historically maybe you just carried the green book with you as a separate option. So make sure you have all that stuff with, and don't be afraid of digital charting as well. One thing I do want to mention here about weather is that the weather can really make a big difference on whether you're going to pass that check ride. And it's worth noting that I like to tell people, look, if you're not normally thinking you would go flying on that day, you probably shouldn't be taking your check ride on that day. Now, it doesn't mean that day has to be clear blue in a million, but it certainly has to be weather that would not adversely affect your ability to perform within those ACS or PTS standards. And it's much like the get there-itis, we get the get done-itis on a check ride, and it's scheduled, and it's, we get out there and say, man, it's 2,500 foot overcast today, and I just don't think I've got the right altitude to get that slow flight in, but I really want to get that check ride done. Well, that's a good time to start thinking about, maybe I shouldn't do this today. If the weather isn't right to do that test, go ahead and reschedule it. There's nothing wrong with rescheduling for weather. It actually shows that you are making a good pilot decision about the weather and understanding what the limitations of all the maneuvers you need to complete are, and determining whether or not the weather on that day is good enough to get that done. In some practical tests, this does require a fairly high ceiling to get this done. If we think about multi-engine check rides where we have to have a high altitude so we can do simulated engine failures, we think about steep spiraling descents on a single engine commercial check ride, we do need fairly high ceilings to make these maneuvers be done in compliance with the ACS or PTS standards. So you might need a 5,000 foot ceiling to really get that check ride done, and in some portions of the country that might mean multiple reschedules to get it done. So I can tell you one from this year that I had. We started in December, and we finally got the right weather to complete it in February. And I think some of it was a little bit of bad luck for the poor guy who just kept scheduling the bad days, but sometimes that happens, and don't let yourself get too frustrated over that. It means you're making good decisions about the weather to make sure that you are going to complete that practical test in a way that doesn't cause you to bust altitudes for weather compliance or leave you at too low of an elevation to complete some of those maneuvers. I can tell you it's an automatic failure on anything other than instrument check ride that if you happen to fly yourself into a cloud. It's a pretty simple thing, but I can tell you it's also happened on a number of practical tests where the applicant gets distracted. They're trying to force the check ride in with marginal weather, and lo and behold, we're into a cloud, and that's an automatic failure at that point. So, don't let the weather determine whether you're going to pass. You need to determine whether the weather is going to be the proper type of conditions that you want to complete that practical test in. So once we begin a check ride, I'm going to add there are 3 possible outcomes, and I add this kind of towards the end here because hopefully the end is what the good one's going to be for you, but we do have 2 other possibilities. Once the check ride has actually begun, an examiner has to issue one of 3 things: either a disapproval if something does not meet the practical test standards. We can also issue a discontinuance if something stops us from finishing the practical test along the way, or if all goes well, we issue a new temporary airman certificate. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the disapproval, but the discontinuance is one that not as many people pay attention to. This is if something stops the check ride from being able to be completed. And that can be any number of things. Perhaps we go out, we do the flight portion, or we do the ground portion, and we come out and find that there's a thunderstorm in the area. Well, we're certainly not going to go flying into that, and we are going to stop the check ride at that point. Doesn't mean you have to redo the areas that have already been completed. It just means you're going to finish it another time. Most commonly this happens for aircraft maintenance issues that are found, or if there's a weather issue. Certainly could happen if you had an impromptu visit from the president and you got stuck under a TFR or something like that as well. But if something stops you from finishing the practical test, you're going to be issued a discontinuance, and basically that just means you're not quite done yet, and you're going to pick it up and finish it off another day. It is worth noting that the applicant can discontinue a practical test at any time during the test, and I've had this happen on a couple of occasions. Most frequently it's happened for unusual attitude recoveries if somebody was a little under the weather that day and they started feeling not so great. So if there is something along the way on the test that causes you to not feel comfortable completing the test, you do have the option to tell the examiner, hey, I'm going to go ahead and stop at this point and let's finish this up another day. Testing will not continue at that point, and you're basically stopping with whatever maneuvers have been completed. It's worth noting you can't use the discontinue to save you from a disapproval. So if the examiner has said, boy, that steep turn you just did, I see you lost 500 feet on it, we're going to go ahead and do a disapproval, it's too late to go ahead and say I'd like a discontinuance now. So it doesn't work for that. But if something is not going the way you want it to, you're uncomfortable with the flight, maybe you're feeling a little under the weather, there's nothing wrong with discontinuing. Or, and I've had this on a couple of occasions, if the weather is changing during the flight and you determine that you wouldn't want to continue doing the maneuvers and you want to pick it up another day, there's nothing wrong with asking for a discontinuance at that point. So as we think about the disapprovals, I want to note there is no failure quota. We don't have to fail anybody. It doesn't mean that people don't fail. Certainly we have issues that when things are not meeting the ACS or PTS standards, we do have to uphold that minimum and we have to issue the disapproval. Doesn't mean anything's really bad, just means we've got something that needs to be practiced or studied a little bit more, and we'll come back and fix it another day. But the reality is if we have 100 people in a row do a great job, we're going to pass 100 people in a row as well. But the same holds true of the other side. If we have 100 people in a row that are doing a bad job, we're not going to pass anybody on that either. So, we don't necessarily have any failure quota, and you can go out and find there are national averages for passing. The private pilot test seems to run somewhere around the 80% mark nationally for initial passing. So that's kind of what we're looking at when we think about if somebody is going to end up with a disapproval, what's going to happen. But it doesn't mean the examiner ever has to issue any. So if you've been at the local flight school and hear that, boy, the last 10 people have passed, that doesn't mean if you're number 11 that you're automatically going to fail. So if by some chance you did not pass on the first try, if you do have a disapproval, it does need to be issued. Doesn't mean things are over, doesn't mean you're a bad pilot, doesn't mean you can't do this, just means we have something that needs to be practiced or studied a little bit more to make sure that they're not deficient on that particular ACS or PTS point. There is no time limit on how soon you can come back, although there are certainly some recommendations. If we have a large number of things on the ground portion that are not quite going very well, I wouldn't recommend trying to come back the same day. It certainly would take some time to study that material and brush up on it a little bit. But if you just had a kind of a brain fart moment and maybe had a short field landing go bad, a little bit of time with your instructor and coming back the next day could be perfectly viable to go ahead and fix that. So it does typically require that you're going to spend some time with your instructor again, get re-signed off, and you do have 60 days to retest within if you have a disapproval issued. And all that's going to be retested is the areas that were found deficient. So if you had, everything else went good and you had a soft field landing that just wasn't quite right, that's really all that's going to be retested on the practical test. So that's kind of an important part to note, that we don't have to retest everything. We just do the stuff that was found deficient. So, if you do have a disapproval, go fix that, come on back, and we'll be happy to issue the temporary airman certificate on the next time you go through. Some of the questions we always get are, what are some of the common failure points on practical tests that we encounter? And maybe kind of a couple lists here. Getting lost is actually something that does happen on a check ride. I know it sounds kind of funny to think somebody's going to get lost on a check ride. This is more commonly something that happens when the pilot gets distracted, or we get you to fly outside of an area that you are really familiar with. This can certainly happen even at your home airport, but sometimes it happens when you fly to another location for a test if you're not very familiar with the area. The best advice I can give you on getting lost is get a chart out, take a look outside, start matching things up, and really get an idea of where you're at, and brush up on those lost procedures before the test itself. So if you are trying to figure out exactly where you're at, you've got some resources available. We think about following the magenta line here. This is a reference to our GPS dependency that many of us have gotten into. And as we work with more advanced aircraft, it becomes critical that we program those systems properly. So if we have incorrectly programmed something, it's going to take us exactly where we wanted, or I guess where we planned on going in the system, but not necessarily where we wanted to go in the first place. This can happen on VFR check rides, but it can also happen more commonly on instrument check rides, where if we have something programmed incorrectly for an approach sequence, that if we're following the magenta line but things are programmed incorrectly, it is probably going to lead us to a disapproval for that check ride. So related to this is getting bogged down in those systems. If something's not quite going right, we get bogged down in the systems as we're trying to do it, and sometimes forget to fly the airplane itself. And I've seen people get bogged down in the systems and lose 200, 300, 400, 500 feet of altitude before they even notice that it's happening, and many times that will take us outside of those ACS or PTS standards. So on many of the check rides, the short field landings are a common failure point. And interestingly enough, this comes down to pilot and command decision making in many cases. Maybe if we have set a touchdown point that we're aiming for, that the wheels are going to contact the ground at the 500 or the 1,000 footers, an applicant will verbalize that and tell me they're going to land on 1,000 footers and then land 500 feet short of it, and do so without any change to the behavior or trying to fix the problem. And really, as an examiner, I can't allow that to be passed, but I certainly can allow you to pass if you're going to be a little bit short and you say, hey, I'm going to add some power here, or I'm going to go around and try this again. We can't let you go around all day long, but a go around or two on your check ride when you're making good decisions, especially if there's some wind you're working with, is something that's perfectly allowable and within the PTS or ACS standards, and shows good pilot decision making. So, if you find you're going to be short on a short field landing, make a good pilot decision and either add some power or correct it, or go around and try it again. So busting minimums is a common one on instrument check rides that we do run into. It kind of speaks for itself, but if there are minimums, you definitely don't want to go below them. So making sure that you are going to stay within the minimums that we have to hold is something that's going to make that instrument check ride go a lot more smoothly. Airspace knowledge is something that is a weak point, and I say this both on the ground portion but also on the flight portion, and we're certainly going to test on many of the practical tests the knowledge of airspace requirements and communication requirements, but we also do this in essence in the flight portion. And many times we've had occasions where somebody has been flying maneuvers and not paying attention to the situational awareness of where they are physically located at that time, and an examiner has needed to stop the applicant from breaking airspace. And this doesn't just mean super busy airspace in Class Bs. It could be that you're flying in a nearby Class Delta and you go outside and you're starting to do maneuvers and you're looking for a good turn around the point item to use to make that circle, and as you do it, you come close to breaking that Class Delta airspace. So as you think about the airspace that you're going to be flying around for the test, it is important to maintain that situational awareness while the examiner is asking you to conduct maneuvers, to make sure that you are aware of the airspace you're in and you're not going to be in any way, shape, or form breaching airspace on that check ride. I kind of tell most of my check ride applicants, if I need to jump in to stop you from breaking you, me, the airplane, or an FAR, we're kind of at an immediate stopping point, and that's a very valid point. We're not allowed on the practical test to allow you to break an FAR, so we do need to jump in if you're going to break airspace or any other FARs as well. The aircraft systems is another piece of this, and in many aircraft we do have to simulate systems failures on practical tests, and knowing how those systems are going to work and how to remedy potential failures is an important part of making sure you're going to pass that check ride. Most common failure items in check rides that we're going to be looking for is maybe potentially alternator or battery failures, certainly gear failures in aircraft that have retractable gear systems, And a multi-engine aircraft, the multi-engine simulated and actual demonstrated failures are critical portions of that check ride. So make sure you know how those systems operate and how you remedy any potential problems with the systems on the aircraft. There are a few kind of insidious and overlooked failure items, and actually we had a conversation at a board meeting this morning for a flight school that the FAA was in for, and there's some of the things that we identified that are common things that are showing up that are less commonly addressed on the actual PTS, but they're in there in the ACS and PTS items as sub-items. So emergency procedures is something that's showing up as a very commonly failed item, and it relates primarily to choosing an appropriate off-field landing site. You know, if you are going to have a simulated engine failure or something wrong that is going to cause you on your practical test to simulate a need to land off-field, make sure that you have chosen an appropriate landing zone, whether it's into the wind or downwind, or depending on what situation you're in, whether you could be using a parachute system if the aircraft is equipped, but making sure you're going to do that in a way that will be the safest potential landing you could make, and adhering to the procedures for the aircraft. We certainly don't want to be flying downwind, making a low elevation turn at the end of it, flying into a wet field with power lines, you know. So we're looking for the best decision making you can have at that time to make sure that you're going to have a safe off-field emergency landing in that simulation. One that does get some very, very minimal coverage, although it does get missed in a lot of cases, a partial power engine emergency. You know, so if we think of an engine that might be starting to fail, if we have a lost cylinder or a magneto failure potentially, you know, what's an applicant going to do if we simulate a partial power engine emergency? And I actually did this on the practical test I did today, where we were flying an Archer, and I simulated a partial power loss. Instead of having full power, you know, I drove the power back, so it was running about 1,800 RPM. And what we're looking for is the applicant to identify, you know, what's my best glide, or can I maintain altitude at the power setting, and then make a decision of, do I need to land off field, or can I make it to an appropriate airport? And this kind of critically teaches and tests the ability of the applicant to make a decision about what resources they have available to them, and whether or not this is a full failure, or if it's something that they can work with and get themselves safely to another location. So don't just think about the engine out as the only emergency. It could be a power loss, it could be a gear failure, it could be an alternator failure. There's a number of things that we are able to simulate on practical tests beyond just pulling the power and saying, hey, you lost an engine. And these other emergencies are some things that do get overlooked in the training a little bit in many cases, that are perfectly viable for testing. As we look at some of the non-towered airport operations, familiarity and comfort with entrance of traffic patterns and management of traffic is something that is a weak point, especially for candidates who have trained solely at towered airports. So if you're an applicant who's working entirely at a towered airport, maybe it's a good idea prior to your check ride to jump out to a couple outlying airports and work with some traffic patterns while you're there. The forward slip to a landing is still something that is required on a check ride in many cases, and it does kind of get forgotten in the training a lot of times. So for many people, it's an uncomfortable maneuver to do, just something that doesn't feel quite as normal as our stable everyday flight, but it is something that should be practiced. And the last one is VOR navigation, and while we are changing our dynamics of how we navigate in the airspace system, and VORs are becoming less commonly used for much of our flying, they are still an item that must be tested, and it is a good idea to understand how to use the VOR navigation systems, even if you're in a TAA aircraft, something that's technologically advanced, that is primarily focused on GPS navigation. The examiner still may ask you to tune to a VOR and see if you can navigate to or from that facility on your practical test. And these are kind of some of the tips I've got for you, and I guess the best advice I can give you along the way is try not to be too scared. I know it's natural to be nervous on a practical test. I try to tell people, you know, nervous is okay, scared's bad. It is a very important day in your pilot career, and obviously everybody wants to be successful. But you know, try not to be too scared. I mean, as you go through this, even your check ride can be a fun flying day. We're still going flying and doing a bunch of maneuvers, and it's always pretty enjoyable when we get to go flying. So even though the check ride has a little bit more pressure on that day, take some time and enjoy it along the way. If you can, meet the examiner prior to the check ride. I've done this many, many times with applicants, and just to understand we're human too. I promise we're not too scary. I had an occasion not too terribly long ago to encounter a gal I gave a check ride to, and we were chatting after, and she had done a private pilot check ride with me, and we're talking about some other stuff, and she said, "Man, you're kind of a real person too." She's like, "And here I thought you just ate small children's dreams for breakfast," and that kind of took me back. And I understand it's very easy to be a little nervous and scared of the examiner, but we're pilots too. We've been there. To get to be examiners, we had to go through all of the same practical tests that you're going through as you pursue these ratings and certificates. We were instructors, and we trained students to do this, so we know exactly what you're going through, and we're going to do everything we can to try and make it so you're not too nervous. We do have to do our job, but you can enjoy that day as well. So I guess at this point, Eric, we can go ahead and open it up to some questions if you like, and I'll be happy to answer anything we can along the way here.
Oh, that sounds great, Jason. A lot of great feedback. We're getting a lot of great information, a lot to digest, a lot of things you've cleared up, certainly. Let's begin with this, kind of a little inside the examiner's mind here in preparing for a check ride from your perspective. But as one of our listeners this evening pointed out, looking through that, we'll use the private pilot ACS as an example. It can seem a little bit overwhelming. Day before the check ride, a few days before the check ride, you're paging through, and there's all this information and all these facts and figures, running through your mind. Tell us a little bit about how you prepare, how you establish a game plan. Is each of your oral exams a little bit different? How do you start those conversations, and what kind of dictates where those oral conversations go to?
So that's a great question, and the reality is, I said that the ACS or PTS is our menu for the check ride, but it does not necessarily dictate the exact questions we're going to ask. Now, it does obviously box us into a certain subject area, and I would say the best thing you can do is make sure the day before the test is not the first time as an applicant that you're looking at that ACS or PTS and trying to decipher all of the things that are going to be asked on that test day. So if you've done that ahead of time, the examiner is probably going to, if we think about a private pilot test, probably going to have given you a cross country to plan out. It's one of the scenarios that we work with. I might say, hey, for your check ride today, imagine that we're flying from Cincinnati to, I don't know, maybe Cleveland for the day, and I'll give you an airport outside of Cleveland. Maybe it's Akron, maybe it's, I guess one of my favorites there, Burke Lakefront. And what you're going to find is the process that we have picked for that is going to force you into giving us some descriptions on that flight portion of airspace along the way, maybe deciphering what the weather is going to be for that flight, maybe doing some performance calculations. Maybe I gave you a small airport, so you're going to have to think about, what's my weight and balance going to be, how much fuel can I take, and so if you start thinking about how the examiner is going to approach the check ride, we're going to build a scenario even from that first phone call that says, all right, well, here's your flight. We're going to fly from Batavia there at Sporty's, and we're going to fly up to Burke Lakefront. I want you to tell me how long it's going to be, and I'm taking Uncle George with me, and, I weigh, 270 pounds, and he weighs 140 pounds. With your weight, how much fuel can we take, and can we make this flight? So that's going to give the examiner's background of, all right, what are they going to be asking you about on that check ride to try and describe, whether you understand how to make that flight successful. So we're going to build a scenario, and we're going to have a number of things incorporated into that are part of that ACS standard for that private pilot. We have to ask you about airspace. We have to ask you about performance planning. We have to ask you about fuel requirements. All of these things kind of can be built into a scenario like that. If I say, here's what we want to do for the day. So if you start looking at what the examiner is going to give you ahead of time, and if they haven't given you something ahead of time, ask them for that. What's your weight going to be for the day? Do I have a passenger with me on this, simulated flight we're going to do, and where do you want me to go? Those are things that are going to help you understand the scenario that the examiner is going to be starting to work with for you on the day of that check ride.
A quick follow-on to that. Has the ACS changed your game plan in terms of how you would approach an oral exam?
So, and I'm going to tell you, I'm a little bit biased on this. I did work at much of the period of the ACS development. I worked with a number of the folks on it in the FAA, so I was probably a little more familiar with the ACS than some of the other examiners when it first came out. It has changed my game plan in minor senses, but the reality is when the ACS was developed, the exact same practical test standards that were in there were brought into the ACS. It was a reformatting of the information with some minor tweaks and an ability to make sure that ACS standard also brought in the knowledge testing information for that testing standard. So the practical test itself has changed very, very little. I will tell you from a personal sense, we as an examiner have to develop what's called a plan of action for the Checkride. So we take the ACS and we develop a plan, which are the things that we're going to cover on that test. It has changed my formatting for that for a little bit. A couple of the briefing items that we give have changed, but that's really about it. The content of the test itself has remained very much the same, with a new focus on making sure we are doing the test in a scenario perspective. So, instead of just saying what's the stall speed of the airplane and you spitting back it's 56, we're going to contextualize that and say, look, we're on short final, and we determine the winds are a little strong, and we keep flaps at half flaps, 20% instead of 40%. What's that going to do to your landing characteristics? Are you going to need more runway, less runway? Does it change your touchdown speed? So we'll build that into scenarios and be very practical with it instead of rote, which is part of the intent of that ACS as well. But the content itself of the test and what we're testing has in no way, shape, or form changed in large part for that.
How about a written test result? Will that have a strong influence on how the Checkride might be administered based on a, say 100% performance versus a 70% performance on a written test?
That's a good question, and it depends a little bit on the type of test. I do know some tests tend to have lower average scores than others. And in some cases, if somebody comes in with a 98 or the 100%, my natural reaction is, oh, they must have used a test prep software and memorized the questions. Because I don't know if I went out and took a test right now if I would score 100% either. So, memorization is not obviously what we're looking for on these tests, but, somebody's at a 72 versus an 85, I can't tell you that changes what I'm going to think of them for the test in any way, shape, or form on the practical test itself. Now, we do have to, as examiners, look up the areas of the knowledge test that there were, errors on. So we do look those up, and maybe our questioning gets modified slightly based on that. If we found there were 2 or 3 notes that performance section of their knowledge test was a little bit amiss, that maybe we'll ask a couple more questions on that instead, but that's really about the only way it seems to change my practical test approach is I will make sure I address the areas that were found deficient on the knowledge test in my portion of the practical test. And that's something that the applicant can look at ahead of time as well. Those test code, the learning statement codes are public, and your instructor and the applicant should be looking at that prior to sign off for the practical test. So those should be areas that are well covered prior to coming for the practical test.
Thank you for that, Jason. One final question. I know it's been a long day for you as well. It's we're kind of in overtime here as it is, but to close out, the question from the audience is how, from the applicant perspective, would they handle a scenario by which a designated pilot examiner is asking for something to be performed that they deem outside the ACS or something they determine is just not safe and something they're not comfortable doing?
And that's a fantastic question. And I can tell you a real world example. We worked with an applicant who contacted us about a practical test. The examiner asked the applicant to demonstrate a power on stall on departure, as in during takeoff at 400 feet above the ground from the airport. And this is certainly well outside safety, well outside PTS standards in this case. And the applicant did the exact right thing they should have. They said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not in accordance with the PTS standards. It's not in accordance with safety. And if you, at this point, tell the examiner, I'm going to discontinue testing and we can discuss this on the ground. That is the appropriate thing to do if there is something that's being asked to be demonstrated that's inappropriate outside the PTS or ACS. The time in the airplane is not the time to go ahead and sort that out. That's a good time to take the opportunity to say, let's go ahead and discontinue, let's come back to the airport, and we'll discuss it on the ground. That is not something that should cause an applicant to get a disapproval. And if you do ever encounter that where it does, it's a great time to contact your local FSDO and discuss that with them, and they will help get to the bottom of whether it was appropriately being asked or not. Nobody should ever be asked to do something that is unsafe or outside those PTS or ACS standards on a practical test.
Appreciate that, Jason. With that, we are going to wrap things up. I wanted to, a quick reminder, something I mentioned at the beginning. Our presentation was recorded this evening, and just a reminder that should be available to everyone by tomorrow afternoon. Be available sporties.com/webinars, also on the Sporties YouTube channel. Be sure and visit Jason Blair's website, jasonblair.net. I believe it was posted up there on the screen. You can follow along, and I know Jason posts blogs from time to time and other information about what he's up to, and you can certainly catch Jason. His works are published in a variety of industry publications as well. Jason, any closing thoughts from your end?
I think just enjoy it out there. Have fun with your tests. Have fun with your training. If you ever have questions, you can find my website there, and you can always get in contact with me. I'm an easily accessible guy. I will tell you sometimes I don't answer immediately because I'm in the air, which is probably the favorite place of both Eric and I to be. But if I don't get back to you right away, I will do it as quickly as possible, and feel free to ask me any questions you ever have. So we're all out there as examiners in this industry, and we enjoy seeing people successfully complete those ratings and certificates, and it's part of our job too, is to help you get through it. So I guess when we're not in the actual testing mode, we can help you in any way, shape, or form, and that goes prior to check rides. If you have questions for us, most examiners are instructors actively as well, and feel free to use us as resources too, and that goes for me too. So if I can ever do anything to help, feel free to contact me.
Jason, thanks so much. To the audience, thanks so much for joining us on this Sporties webinar presentation. Do check up our upcoming options at sporties.com/webinars. Hope to see you again very soon. For Jason Blair, I'm Eric Radke, wishing everyone a great night.